Hello, wonderful people. It's good to see you. I am Justin Ribeiro. We're going to talk about the creative trade-off today, particularly around the nature of governance and conflict and how that impacts innovation as we look at software developers working in open source. So if we think about the nature of the way developers start, typically it's at a blinking cursor, right? We think about it as this idea of characters and operators coming together to form some piece of code that we, as an individual software developer, think is particularly interesting and useful. Whether or not it's useful, though, by itself, it might be useful to us, but is it useful to others? And so we often think about this in the scope of projects, right? We commit code to projects. That might be a personal project to start. We may open source that thing. And at the end of the day, you end up with something that fundamentally you want to share with others, right? We need to be able to share that and operate against it. Because at the end of the day, chances are teammates relying on you to deliver that item, right? Hey, where's that thing you're working on? I need that for my piece next. But it's not quite the same thing, right? One-to-one individualism against two developers is not the same as, say, the scrum master or your boss, who might be at an organization you work at, who have different opinions of the work that you might actually be doing. The scrum master is only worried about points, and we all know how good points are in an agile system, and your boss doesn't really care about the thing you've developed. They're just fundamentally wondering if you can get it done faster and cheaper. And so as we start to think about this, we say, well, okay, I'm still going to commit this thing in some fashion, and I'm going to do the thing that we all do as developers. I've been a developer for 30 plus years. I've worked in open source and corporate world things all the time. You push something. When in doubt, push a branch. Push something to trunk, see what happens. Really explore the space. But the reality is that eventually you're going to end up here in the land of pull request reviews. Now we're using pull request here just as the general vernacular. I realize there are different words and different terms for these things. Pull request stakeholder number one is always going to love it. Like most reviewers, stakeholder number two hates your idea every single time. Ever had a paper you've submitted to a journal? Reviewer two, gonna ruin your day every time. So, but that's not the only people who have a stake in what you've just committed to them, right? You've also got code reviewers, the people who are actually in the nuts and bolts of what those code bases actually do. Code reviewer number one, they're always, always looking for one more test. Why is that? I don't know. We're never writing enough tests. And then number two is always going to bring up something that 5 years ago we decided was a bad idea, apparently. But at the end of the day, there are code reviewers who come to you and say, hey, I kind of like this or not. Now, that's not the only problem, though, is it? Because at the end of the day, you actually have the maintainer. Now, there's the corporate maintainer who is very happy to get your contribution as long as you sign whatever shill form they have put into your code review system. And then the open maintainer is just happy someone is caring about the project they're running. So there is differences across a wide range of units analysis. And then to make everything a million times worse, then you got to deal with the AI, which I put in here recently because everyone asks me, Justin, where does the AI fit on here? It does that. Like, that's what it does right now. And we'll talk a little bit about that at the end because it's just hard to get away from. And so for the last 4 or so years, I've spent a lot of time thinking about the nature of the way creativity surfaces for developers and the way we operationalize it as maintainers in open source projects. So this is a shorter version of a much longer research question I have around the nature of how that actually plays out. But to answer this question, you actually have to start at a fundamental. You actually have to go a level deeper still. Because at the end of the day, what is creativity? Most of you in the room have an idea of what creativity is to you based on the very nature of me saying the word creativity. Now, if you get all into the philosophy side of the world, the Greeks thought it was, the nature of poetry. You had Kant who thought it was the exemplary, but he was very idealized on the idea of genius. If you go to someone like Maria Mitchell or say Margaret Fuller, they would say, oh, it's about the idea of beauty, the thing that sort of comes out of science. Theoretically, if you get down into the weeds, it's across the board. There is no lack of perspective on the way creativity is surfaced in the sciences. Everything from cognitive frameworks to your sort of social psychology. Across the board, you will find people trying to figure out what is creativity. Now, while that's great, the problem is, of course, is that we end up with a lack of uniformity. We don't have a good means to understand what is creativity research. It's been a consistent impediment in creativity research for a number of years. Now, for my research, we distinguish it based on the characteristics of sort of the creative product or output around the originality primarily, as well as sort of the effectiveness of its value. Now, this is not my pure definition. This is kind of the standard definition of more recent research. Runco and Jaeger talk about this in their 2012 paper, but there's a lot of more recent research that basically uses that as the baseline. But if you start to talk about the theoretical, then you have to really start thinking about questions of units. What unit of analysis are we actually looking at when we talk about these things? Well, specifically, we can go up and down the chain. We can look at the individual level. We can talk about the intrinsic and extrinsic nature of creativity as an individual developer, someone who might commit something into a team or group, potentially a project or organization. And largely, this is encompassed by the social environment. And so we think about it and adopt the idea that it is an interactive multi-level process. It has to go up and down. Individually by itself alone does not work. And so if you start to think about that, then you have to think about really going down to the deep into the weeds. You have to think about development approaches. Justin, what is a development approach? Don't we talk about methodologies? Practitioners talk about methodologies. I talk about methodologies all day long to corporate developers who can't tell me a methodology most of the time anyhow. But an approach transcends just a methodology. It's about not just the practice, it's about the philosophical assumption. This idea of what we envision and what we design and what we plan to fundamentally execute as a greater social organization. Because at the end of the day, it's a collaborative effort. Software, when we build it, is collaborative. Now, this aligns pretty firmly with sort of my multi-level perspective on when it comes to creativity. And it aligns really well with Woodman and whatnot. Woodman had a systems level view of creativity, which I'm not going to go into right now. But once you start talking about approaches, then you got to talk about governance. Justin, isn't an approach the same thing as governance? It is and it isn't. Really? Governance is this idea that there are structures and there are processes that we as project maintainers define. We define, we monitor progress, we do all the things that are required to ship software, be it features or patches or whatever those things may be. And as open source software grows, any project, governance changes. Early projects, I mean, I've run a lot of them. I'm sure all of you have run them in your respective things. Oh, it's so simple at the beginning. Ad hoc, I know 3 people who are working on this with me. Then those 3 people become 30. And then you start to question your reality because managing 30 people without governance becomes very, very difficult. And so we start to grapple with this and this idea of 2 types of governance. One is open governance, this idea of the decentralized decision-making that we see typical in open source for large projects. Then we've got corporate governance, which is characterized by that sort of more structured leadership, if you want to call it that, and the tighter controls around it. Now, there's a lot of research on this, much too much to go into in a talk of this nature. But the reality is that most of it focuses on decision-making processes. You end up in this world of, can I do it faster? Can I make it more effective? Can I ship stuff? Then it never talks about creativity. It doesn't talk about innovation. Von Hippel, Von Crow, they all talk about the nature of how much more innovative open source is. And yet we very rarely talk about it in the nature of governance. We talk about it in the nature of control structures. And then on top of that, if you've got people governed and you've got an approach, then of course you have conflict because not everyone gets along. Not everyone agrees on the very fundamental of that item. So it's an interactive social process. It's not one particular thing. It's this idea of understanding these sort of multi-level tensions that occur. Now, most creativity and conflict research, which there's a little bit, show nonlinear relationships. And you'll see a little bit more of this as we get into the weeds in the data. But fundamentally, we also know that it's very pervasive in software development. Most of us didn't need journals to tell us that, if anyone's ever committed code in a project. But we've studied it. We know it's there. And we know that, again, the struggle is that mostly it prioritizes resolution and efficiency because we love resolution and efficiency when it comes to research. But it doesn't talk about creativity. And then finally, you end up with the innovative output. What actually comes out the other side? You have all this tension, you have this conflict, you have governance, you've got code artifacts. Now what happens? Well, we ideally should foster innovation. It is a fundamental tenet of what we do. Show me a developer who doesn't want to innovate, and I'll show you someone who's not a developer. Every developer wants and believes that they are being creative and being innovative. And I'll show you some of that as well. And the problem, of course, here is that, like creativity, novelty also has a very significant gap. How do we define it? How do you technically define it? How do you measure it empirically? And code itself is rarely the sole determinant, as you'll see. So if we do all that, and we think about the theories that we have in hand, and we say, well, we're taking a multi-level interactionist approach, we kind of need a theoretical model, some concept that we can work towards. And so we kind of come up with this. Individual creates an artifact, there's an exchange, the share. That social exchange creates cognitive conflict against a multi-level situation, individual, team, and org. You can think of org as governance in this case. The decision, they're going to accept the novel artifact. So simple. How do you study it? Because it's quite complex in terms of a model when you get down to it. There's a lot of theory to break down. And so we need a bold research design. Fundamentally, we need to step back and understand the nature of the way ISD research sort of happens. And in the creativity sphere, Hennessy and Amible, Teresa, right? A stalwart in creativity research. They have noted recently that it's lacking a truly systemic sort of quality of late. We have a tendency to study creativity in individual facets. And so we need to sort of design a method that sort of gets to the heart of this, because otherwise we're just sort of scraping the surface of it. And so we adopt a mixed methods approach here, which is going to merge qual and quant to give us a holistic view, which is a more popular approach these days in a lot of the higher end journals, as Venkesh and folks point out. Yet only about 3% of papers use this, just as an FYI, because as you'll see, it gets a little bit tricky, hence the 4 years. So you got to have a research methodology. You got a top level sort of umbrella research question, and you end up with 3 strands. First strand is a qual strand. You got to dig at the heart of it. We use grounded theory in this strand to figure out exactly how developers actually perceive things and see the world. The quantitative strand starts to define our sort of team structure. How do open source projects actually handle the effects of that? So instead of a how or to what extent question, you end up to a what effects with hypotheses. And then because I'm, a little crazy, strand 3 is a convergent parallel strand. How many people have ever seen a convergent parallel strand outside of the book? Well, turns out they are quite hard to run, which is why it took me forever. It's a quant-qual double strand that is run parallel. It converges at the end, as the name implies. And you'll kind of see how this works, which uses both quant and qual data. And now I'm going to caveat this heavily. It is impossible to go through 4 years of research in 45 minutes. Not only 4 years, 4 years and 40 pounds. I was so much lighter when I started this. So you're going to get a sort of skimmed version of the surface of this. You can read about it. I've got papers that are in process. The dissertation covers all of it if you want to read all 337 pages of it, which I do not recommend. But we're going to try to get to the heart of it from both a practitioner perspective and as an academic perspective. But if you're an academic, you're going to say, Justin, where are the robustness checks? Justin, where's the FE, CFA? I understand. It's all there in the other paperwork. Let's start with that first qual one. The development approach paradox. One of the things that we found out after we talked to 31 developers was that a lot of developers perceive themselves as being very creative, but if you start to ask them about what happens to their creativity, particularly in their corporate sort of open source environment worlds, what they'll tell you is that they don't know. They perceive it, but they can't actually put their finger on it as to what happens to it. And then what ends up happening, as we found, is that they start to have a crisis of conscience. I thought I was super creative and innovative, but then all of a sudden, wait, I'm not? And so what ended up happening is we would run interviews. We would code those interviews with grounded theory, Corbin Strauss, Sharmaz, constructors of view. And then people started telling us things like this. Work's not the place where I can innovate. I'm just trying to get it done based on what the product people want. This sort of a paradox really shook a lot of people. I have a lot of memos around this that came back where people were like, "Oh, Justin, I need to talk about this because I'm having a crisis of my career." Based on your questions, the IRB was not pleased. What seemed like a very simple question turned into a very life-affirming question for quite a few people that eventually came back to us. And so then we said, well, we got to go test this. But how do you test it? How do you empirically test something? How do you go from the qual to the quant? Well, we got to get creative. One is that we need to build a data set. So we're going to use covariance-based structural equation modeling. I pulled data from 40 open source projects, web, library, framework type of things. You can think React, Angular, all the sort of ecosystem stuff that exists out there, around roughly 11,000 releases. This is not uncommon. There's lots of people who do research on GitHub data. I built a new tool to go and mine the depths of it, because my unit analysis is not simply an individual interaction, it's the depth of interactions that occur. So it is multi-level in this regard. And then I use computational analysis to go through 82,000 of those baseline interactions to give us trace data. Justin, what's that look like? It kind of looks like this. Typical developer pull request, a pull request comment, a code review comment, all typical things you might see on an open source project hosted on GitHub. We start to look for those interactions, that trace data. So developers are really, really good at this. I myself am very pedantic about it when I write code commits. I might use conventional commit language, which is pretty common in the web framework library standard these days for most folks. I might use interactions that tell me the sentiment of people feeling on those comments and the way they interact. And so using all this trace data, we sort of come up with a combined model. Oh, it looks so simple. And then we're going to put governance on top of it and make it even harder. Developer creativity causes release commit novelty. We know the release commits that go into it because they have release notes. We know that people assign various aspects of it because that came out of the qual data. That's what emerged out of the data set. And then we look at code review conflict and pull request conflict and a whole bunch of controls because you got to control for certain things. Again, seems like a very simple model. The struggle, of course, is that you have to define those constructs. How do you actually take trace data and can define them? Release commit novelty is that perceived novelty. Maintainers write release notes. They review release notes if they're generated, so on and so forth. Developer creativity, again, they articulate their novel ideas as part of pull request, commits, secondary commits, additional items. Cognitive conflict, higher order construct. 3 formative dimensions. Emotional tension, disagreement, and reputational interference. Because we know their reputation based on where they sit in the project. Because GitHub loves reputation. Justin, that must be a lot of math. The math does not fit well on the slides. To stick it on there. In my defense, I had slides that did this, and most people were just squinting. The gist is that there's a lot that goes into it to create formative dimensions of this type. They're not reflective, to be clear, and so they don't necessarily correlate with each other, right? That's the nature of a formative construct. And the nature and the equation and how you could replicate this is all in the dissertation. So if you want to see the math is all in there as well as all the robustness checks against it to verify. So what happens? If you run that model and you take all that data and you do the math, you run the robustness, you do split sampling, the whole 9 yards, what do you get? Individual creativity has very limited effect on release novelty. About 4-ish% beta-wise, standardized beta. Very tiny. When you start putting conflict, though, all of a sudden code review and PR conflict have more effect on release commit novelty. Okay, social interaction, I like this. Code reviews, much stronger than pull request reviews. Interesting, we can mine that a little bit more. And it does look like there is a quadratic there, right? We've got a little diminishing return. All right, do we have a turning point? Let's see. And then we do have some complementary mediation effects. We know that those things, using instantaneous effects, will actually create this complementary mediation. I will improve your creativity and come out with release novelty. Visually, it kind of looks like this. So from a code review standpoint, it's got a little bit of a bend and a pretty tight R. We'll talk about the R later, or the R squared rather. Pull request, ooh, there's a bend. So you do have a curved linear effect. The more conflict you have, you eventually tail off on your innovation. You don't get anything else out of it. But that's for all 40 projects. What happens if we start to run that third strand? Well, one thing that sort of comes out immediately is that there's the perception of control in our open source world. Maintainers understand that they are the gatekeeper, which is very, very much in the sort of creativity realm of things. Gatekeepers sort of define the nature of the way we accept creativity into other innovative forms, be it computational in Bowden's world or Csikszentmihalyi's world in terms of systems. So they know that they are the final gate to make sure that thing is the innovation they want it to be. And so all of a sudden, if you split that set, because roughly it was about a 50-50 split, 52-48, if I remember correctly. Creativity on release commit novelty differs a lot between open governance and corporate governance. As a matter of fact, open governance, slightly stronger. Ooh, corporate governance, negative. That's not good. Now, Justin, you might say, well, Justin, why is -0.1 any different from 0? You could say this. What I will say that this is a moderating effect. So to have any effect against a moderator in this regard is pretty interesting from a theoretical standpoint, because moderators typically don't work. They're very hard to get to work. And again, as we sort of parallel these strands, one thing that came out very quickly was that when we interviewed maintainers in those projects, guess what they said? Corporate governed projects are about efficiency and stability. They don't care about novelty. Developers understand and perceive it as that's the way they operate those projects. And so immediately you already start to see something. But the conflict differs vastly against the review stage as well. All of a sudden, open governance shows a really strong positive effect. Apparently, in the open sort of the world, we're really good at code reviews, people. We're doing a fine job because they spike the living daylights out of novelty. They will tease out novelty from creativity, from those individual developers. Not as much in corporate. Corporate's still pretty good. Not as good as open governance. Quadratic-wise, corporate governance actually has more of a positive effect in their pull requests with higher diminishing returns. We actually get a turning point on this one, as you'll see. So if we graph them against each other, the fitted curve here, the green line is corporate governance. Red line is open governance. And this is against code reviews. So again, we see a slight diminishing return with a higher peak, but you get about the same crossover in code review land. So apparently we're also fairly solid in code review land when it comes to these things. But when we have external stakeholders, things go really sideways really quickly. We are better at understanding and listening to the community because you actually get an inverse relationship in open effects. We listen to pull request stakeholders more often than not. Corporate does not. Corporate actually turns and goes negative on you. That's why you get the turning point at the end of the graph. So what, Justin? Why do I care about this? Why does this make any sense to us from either a research or practitioner state? Number one, it's because development approach matters. Too often we take into account that creativity is this intrinsic attribute. A lot of the research in the 2010s said that creativity will just happen. If you look at the agile research, it's just there. It happens all the time. But when we interviewed corporate developers, guess what they said? There's no innovation for us in agile. Like, we can't do anything in agile. I got points and I got sprints. I don't even know what's going on half the time. And so developers will perceive themselves as very creative, but the approach, whether it fosters, will not hold. And development approaches are not passive. You have to actively configure them. The conditions of which we do as people who maintain and govern projects determine whether or not creativity survives or we foreclose on it, that it just simply goes away. And again, developers will identify those challenges. They understand they're being judged. They understand the nature of the effects of review stage. They don't understand the extent of it, which is what we start to show here, right? That there are these vastly different effects in these different stages. But as open source maintainers, one thing we must understand is that we need to manage and create conditions where the development approach will help you and help find other contributors into your project. Social interactions matter. We talk a lot about the negativity in some spheres, in certain projects. Some maintainers are not the easiest people to deal with. I like to think that I'm a very open maintainer on the things I still maintain. But the reality is that the development approach does not sit in isolation. Just because you have a process or definition doesn't mean that it actually works that way. You need a broader sort of social technical context to sort of deal and exert that influence. Now, at the team level, right, innovative outcomes are shaped by cognitive conflict. We show that in the second strand. And then again, that conflict, for most people, though, developers don't see it as conflict. You can't take conflict as the negative. They see it as collaboration. Strand 3 in that parallel strand, if you ask them about conflict, there's no conflict. We're just working through code. What's wrong with working through code? Is that bad? It's the kind of responses we got. Because to them, the conflict might be a disagreement about approach, but fundamentally it's about shipping better code for the project. And we need to dispel that myth of that sort of lone hacker. It's a very fun myth because everyone thinks they're cool. I know in the 90s I thought I was cool. It's a long time ago now. You know that movie Hackers came out and I was like, that's about me. I felt it. But alas, that's not the way innovation outcomes work, right? It's just not. So that social aspect of it, right? We know that the sort of open governance informs and inspires, while the corporate governance sort of tamps it down. Corporate could learn a thing or two, be more open about the nature of open collaboration and hybrid approaches, which there is a lot of research on. I'm not going to cover it right now. We got to get rid of that toxic hero programmer line. I hear it at least once a week from various people I talk to. It makes me sad. And then that context still matters. Simplicity hides the simplicity of code, right? When we sit there and write code, you know when you've written that perfect line of code where you're like, you know what? I can't make this any better. But the reality is that it's the social shaping of that thing that helps define it. Org governance will shape that in inverse ways. Open's positive, corporate's negative. And you can't treat them as the same. They are not homogeneous review stages. Pull request has valid uses. Those conversations are about stakeholders who are not probably writing code, but they're interested in your features. You still need to take them into account, but you don't have to treat them the same way. We, of course, have limitations in this. I'm going to cover a few of them. Theoretical framework generally is tied to a very specific context of development approaches, primarily open corporate governance. We do not split or explain other types of governance. I'm being very wide in this definition of it in terms of the way that governance was written from those projects. We used iterator reliability to verify that, to make sure that everyone agreed as that's what the governance was, and we did talk to other maintainers in those projects. Boundary conditions are rough in this because, again, it's project context. So just because we found this in web-style projects doesn't necessarily mean it transfers to all things. We would want to run additional studies to make sure that we can say, oh, works the same way if we do this in, say, Apache Foundation projects or other style projects. Conceptual ambiguities, they're rough. Again, I didn't go through the math and all of the things that sort of come to those sort of standardized betas that go into this because it takes a long time. And I'm doing pretty good on time actually right now. I'm feeling good about this. The struggle is that there is ambiguity in the nature of the word creativity and innovation. There are definitions in the OECD, but the struggle, of course, is that how do you operationalize them? It is very, very difficult to do. You have to take a bold stance and then defend that stance to your reviewers. That's just the nature of the beast. This was pretty bold, admittedly. The math took a long time. My collaborators, we went through this immensely. And again, this is another 4 years to probably publish most of this, which is what we're working on now. And it's four or five papers, I think, right now. But you have to take the leap. To only accept the conceptual ambiguity is to only graze the top of what theory needs to be to help practitioners build the next great set of projects. So you have to take that risk. And again, there's measurement, complexities. Cognitive conflict. Cognitive conflict is written about quite a bit. It's not written about much in information systems anymore. It was somewhat popular in the 90s. Kind of fell out of favor, as things do in the research sort of scopes. The struggle with cognitive conflict is that there's a whole bunch of additional dimensions that you simply cannot measure using trace data. We pulled a lot of data, and it took almost a year to sort of process it and verify all the things needed. But cognitive conflict is one of those things that, again, is probably a paper on its own to try to define and operationalize those measures in reasonable ways from a robustness standpoint. So it is, in my opinion, still a limitation on some of this. There would be more work to do from a publishable standpoint. Justin's concluding thoughts. There is an elegance in creativity. Code is, for me, is very important. I love development. I have been writing code since I was 8. My mother, a mainframe engineer at the time, taught me how to write BASIC on a C64. Trust me, that woman has more patience than I know what to do with as a guy with a lot of kids. But there is this beauty in that. To move away from elegance is to move away from sort of the beauty and philosophy that is in science itself. And I think sometimes we forget that when we start to think about the nature of when that elegance appears in front of developers, in front of maintainers, in front of the governance structures that we put into place. Because at the end of the day, it's a team sport. I can write the most amazing thing, but if I don't get to share it, and someone doesn't have some feedback on it, constructive or otherwise, then what am I doing? I've created art for the sake of myself. Even in the art world, it doesn't really work in terms of creativity. That's not how art is created. It's not what makes it, which is a huge debate in and of itself. I consider code to be some of that art, some of that elegance, some of that beauty. And again, we should not fight the team sport. We should understand that it's still a social endeavor, especially in open source. We know this. We've all been there. But in the research knows it too. It just takes a little while to find its way into the sort of practitioner sphere sometimes. And given that we have a multi-level interaction, Justin, why not add another level with some artificial intelligence? Because everybody asks when I've given this or a version of this talk here and there. Generally speaking, a lot of the research is not about AI and creativity. There is some. But it's really about operationalization, which at the moment, the more rigorous studies show that it erodes trust in developers. They don't quite trust the thing that comes out, especially more senior developers who can sort of catch that code smell as they see it arrive. The problem here is that a lot of the AI stuff is also around a lot of what we would consider the management science of things. So like the struggle here as well is that it's about efficiency. By goodness, like it's always about efficiency. If we're more efficient, then we can ship more code and that'll be better. Is it? Some of our more stable projects don't ship every week. They are not using CI/CD continuous deployment structures. And you know what? The world continues to turn and they're quite innovative and run the world. And so we need to be careful in that regard. And there's a new paper from Lee and folks Microsoft put out from Microsoft Research earlier this year about the problem of high confidence. We need to do some replication there to verify and see exactly if that's really the case in terms of less critical thinking. There have been some other studies that show that it improves critical thinking, which don't get as much play because they were smaller samples. And then again, the struggle here isn't so much in the academic sphere, I would say. I mean, the conversation is ongoing. I think a lot of us here have probably had those conversations with our collaborators about how should you approach it? How can we study it in reasonable ways with developers? The struggle is that there's a lot of practitioner, quote unquote, research these days that seems to really tell you all the things that you need to know about AI. What I would say is you have to beware the pull headline. Because once you start to read those papers, and I hesitate to call some of them papers, they lack the rigor required, not just from an academic standing, just from a standing. Like you need some level of confidence that the methods you've used, the analysis you've done, you have some replicability in this. And that, I think, has been an ongoing struggle. This is not to say that AI cannot necessarily, sort of help people be creative. Computational creativity theory has sort of spoken about that the last 20 years or so. And again, this is to some extent some of the more philosophical side of computational creativity when it comes to things. That a lot of that research is very, very different than sort of the social sphere research that you would see when it comes to creativity. But I think there is a merging of some of that. My collaborator Neil and Diane London are having those conversations because he runs a lab out there. And so, with that, thank you so much for listening. Pitchforks and torches are in the back. I'm happy to take questions if you have them, or, again, hurl things at me if you like.
As someone who's actively looking for my first open source project to contribute to, what would be green lights for a creative?
I would start at the intrinsic level as you personally. So one thing that, from a creativity standpoint, that makes creativity work when it comes to software development, and is particularly picking open source projects, because there is a little bit of research about how developers find their ways into open source projects. The one that you want to find is one that you have a truly intrinsic passion about. Intrinsic qualities within software development go back all the way through most of the cognitive science and social psychology when it comes to that. So first off, you got to ask yourself, what do you want to do? And that could be, I really enjoy writing in language XYZ. So if you have a language requirement that you're like, I just enjoy this. Look, my favorite language to write, and this is going to really date me, was Perl. I enjoy Perl immensely, primarily as a child, because it was the first major piece of software I ever wrote that shipped. I still love Perl. I am terrible at writing Perl. Let me tell you, the mind wanders over 35 years. But the key is that was my intrinsic nature. I had learned it, I had done something with it, and then I went and contributed to it. And so you really got to look at projects where you think you can do it. Not just from a code standpoint. A lot of people I tell to get started in documentation. Documentation is just as important. I think we undervalue it from a creative aspect of it, and that you should look to those sort of projects. There are lots and lots of good projects. Big projects always have good first issue trackers. Good projects typically have those open conversations. I would look through those issue tracker. I'd look through pull requests and see how they treat developers in that regard. And then that way you can figure out what your creative contribution to that might be. And again, it always starts with a conversation. Ideally, not in Slack. Ideally, not in Discord. But, you try as best you can to connect with them as you may. But start with what you're passionate about. For me, that was random Perl software on really old hardware back in the 90s. Really early versions of Perl when Larry put it out. Long time ago now. It's a good question.
So there were two things. Your last slide talked about how this is no longer a team sport.
Oh, it is a team sport. Sorry.
But when we started way back in 92-ish,
Sure.
this was not a team sport.
Absolutely was not.
So how has the nature of consensus changed over the period of time that you're talking about?
Nature of consensus have changed quite a bit. Von Crow and von Hippel talk about this pretty much in the sort of the private collective problem when it comes to the nature of the way we have started to build software since the early 90s. In particular, that communications channels got better to have conversations that were otherwise held inside things. So my classic example is Bell. It wasn't that you were an individual developer at Bell necessarily. It was that you had a tight unit of people you trusted to talk to. And so the problem wasn't so much that no one wanted to communicate. It just became easier. So the tools of the trade, the internet expanded. We had significantly more value in our ability to have those conversations in open ways. Mailing lists became a huge thing, right, in the late or the early 90s rather. That really opened up the world, I think, a lot better than a lot of the BBSs at the time. And that sort of drove our ability to collaborate. Now, this is not to say there are not outliers to the problem of the team sport. There will always be outliers and individuals who rise above it. And there's one in every ecosystem as far as I can tell. I have not researched that. It's sort of on my list, is that I'm convinced that based on my own sort of travels, right? That's how I get my research ideas, which is, I wonder, There's always one who wants to always solo it. They're listening, but they're not giving you feedback against the listening, which is sort of it's not a paradox, but it is a problem of a lot of sort of the social psychology aspect of it, where you end up with sort of March's exploitation fallacy. This idea that I might listen to you, but I'm never going to collaborate with you, but I'm going to take it, I'm going to build that thing, and then you end up with a lot of like things. But overall, the very tools we built gave us the means to sort of go from those single individuals who were, writing things like that, like when Larry wrote Perl, right? Or when Linus started working on the kernel, and all these little things that we take for granted to some extent now, because it was so long ago. But realistically, the tools that we started to fish out is the things that helped us to build that
I
collaboration.
was thinking the two things of Samba, which is starting with 2 people, and Tridwell doing Allison, now has a total team of 40. The governance model still remains pretty much the same. Tridwell has retired after you've had falling out with Linus.
Yeah.
But, the analytics kernel you're talking about is still an email list.
And again, like, this is I think that it's the beauty of open source. I think people think that it has to be one way. It definitely does not. And again, like, a lot of people often ask me, Justin, I would love to get started working on the kernel. And they'll often ask, Justin, have you ever worked on the kernel? And I would say, I have, but not on the mailing list. I worked on it privately for corporations, building, set-top boxes and things of that nature. And they're like, well, why didn't you contribute up? You're being a horrible open source contributor. And I would say, I am, because I can't code to the standard required by that community. And I understand that personally. I don't take it as a fault. I just know where my limit is against that. Now, again, a lot of people complain about this. There's a lot of studies on the Linux kernel mailing list and the nature of the interactions around it. You want to talk about conflict. Conflict,
I work for Nginx. No conflict.
and this is, and again, like, the beauty of conflict and the nature of communication, right? Again, it really boils down to that social interaction. And this is the thing that, spending years and years and years sort of being in it, and then you step away from it, and you have to be very objective, and then everyone screams at you, your collaborators, your chair, everybody. You got to step away from this. You're too close to it. And the reality is, though, is that once you start to read other people's studies and go into that, you realize that the method or the mode of communication doesn't change the social aspect of it, because the social community will define its own norms. And that's what happens, bar none, where things don't change and still work. Because, again, the community defines those norms, and if those norms are still accepted, they will continue to operate. It doesn't mean they're less toxic. I think that's where people have a tendency to say, well, can you believe so-and-so said this on the mailing list in the public? Look, we've all been there. We've seen them. I mean, I follow the mailing list like everybody else. But the struggle, of course, being is that, are you attached to that outcome as well? And so that's where sort of social attachments come into play. A friend of mine, she is researching that right now, and the nature of how people attach themselves to not even outcomes, to literal words in those mailing lists. But yeah, a lot of, again, like, you don't see governance change a lot for projects that work. And that's why, to some extent, that mailing list has never changed. It's been the same way for forever.
All right, it's 12:30. I have to interrupt. We're at the end of our time, but let's thank our speaker once again. This is an awesome talk.
Thanks.